In this lesson, we'll start to work on the shading and texturing for our smoke particles. Okay, so at this point now we have our aircraft here. We have the particles that are sort of lifting off and sort of coming out the back as this plane starts to lift off. So what we need to do now is start to work on the texturing and the shading of these particles. So right now, if we come in and just do a quick render of this, what we should see is that the particles do render out, but they just render out pretty much the same way that they show up in the viewport. They're just sort of a flat little square shape. Now when it comes to working with these types of particles that we've set up, we can texture these and work with these really the same way that we would texture and work with any other object in our scene. We're going to do this through the material editor. So I'm going to tap the M key on my keyboard to bring up my Slate material editor. So let's start by coming in and we'll just give these particles a material. So in my case, I'll start with the standard material. We'll just come down here, click, and drop this into my scene. Move this over to the side so we can see this a little bit easier. I can just take my material, drag, and drop that directly onto my particles. So now the next time I render, we should see these particles inherit this sort of a gray color. Okay, very nice. Now, let's come in, start to actually give this some texture, make this look a little bit more interesting. Now, we could actually have some fun with this and actually have our particles shaded based on their age. So we could do is, let's just right click out here. I find this sometimes to be a little bit easier than going through and searching through some of my maps over here, although we could find what we're looking for underneath the Maps tab. And this is going to be under the particle age. But again, another way that we could get to this is to just right click in this empty space, go to Maps, Standard, and let's drop in this particle age. There we go. Now if we double click on this, we can see that we can actually shade our particles based on their age. So where the particle's age is 0%, or the particle has just been born, it's going to be shaded black. As the particle starts to reach about the halfway point of its total age, it starts to shift more to this gray, and then once it reaches 100%, or its end age, the color is going to be more this white. Now we can come in and completely shade this any way that we want. So I'll make this a little bit easier for you to see. Let's go with maybe kind of a red, a blue, and sort of a green here. Okay, that should be really easy to pick out. Now we can just take this particle age, drop this into something like the diffuse color of the material that we're using for our particles. We can call this particle material. There we go. And this is already connected to our particles, so right away whenever we render this out, we should see now a little bit more of a change. You can see now we have exactly what we would expect to see. So as the particles are born, they're shaded more this blue. As they start to age, they start to gradually transition into more this red. And then by the time the particle reaches the end of its life, it starts to transition into a little bit more of this green. So really, really interesting particle shading effects that we can start to do. So obviously this is going to be a little bit too strong, but just to demonstrate the fact that we can shade this, what I would probably try to do though is go for something a little bit more subtle, maybe kind of a little bit more of a lighter blue toward the beginning of its life, and then maybe toward the end of its life it just kind of shifts to a little bit more of this white. There we go. Something just a little bit more natural, a little bit more subtle in my case. Okay, very nice. I think that'll work out just fine. Now, let's come in and start to add some transparency to this, because right now, if we take a look at our rendered frame, you can see obviously these particles just show up as these little squares. Now we probably don't want that. We want something that looks a bit more natural, so we're going to use an opacity map to control that. So here in our particles where we have opacity, we can just take that connection, click, and draw that out. As soon as I let off my mouse, we have a map that we can plug in. So let's go to our standard maps, and in this one, let's use our gradient ramp. There we go, very nice. So if we double click on this, we can see sort of what we have here. So it's going to be just this gradient ramp that goes from left to right. We come in and render that out. We should see, if you look very closely, that that gradient ramp is actually being applied. So we should have a little bit more opacity sort of showing up in here, a little bit more transparency. It's a little bit hard to see what's actually happening though. What we should be able to do though is let's come in and try to get something that is, instead of having a gradient that goes from left to right, let's try to give these particles a little bit more of a rounded appearance. So I'm going to switch my gradient from a linear to a radial. Okay, now let's take a render and see what that does. So as we start to render that out, it really doesn't look like it's having much of an effect. What we should really be seeing is more of a sort of transparency effect right in the middle, and then it should actually start to get a little bit more opaque as we start to radiate outward. So in this case, we're using color to control opacity. So in the outer areas where it's totally white, that should be full opacity. Down here where it transitions into full black, that should be 0 opacity. So we should actually be seeing some transparency there. But again, if you take a look at our render, that's actually not what is happening. So here is something that is very, very important to remember whenever you're going to take some sort of a texture like this and map it onto particles. What we need to do is go back to our particle material, and we need to turn on this option right here, Face Map. What that'll do is make sure that this texture gets mapped correctly onto these particles. So now, when I come in and hit render, we should see a little bit more of an effect going on here. Okay, so it's still fairly subtle. What'll make this a little bit easier to see is if we take this map and let's basically flip these colors. So I'll take this map, switch that to white, take this one on the other side and switch that to black. So now we should have a 0 opacity out in these outer areas. Let this render out. There we go. That's looking much better. So now we're basically cutting out all of the opacity on the outer part of these particles. Okay, very nice. So again, make sure that whenever you're going to take something like this map and put it on these particles, make sure that on your particle material you do have this option checked, Face Map. You can see otherwise if I turn that option back off, that gradient isn't going to be mapped on there properly. Okay, so we have our gradient on here. We're off to a pretty good start, but the problem right now is these particles still feel a little bit perfect, a little bit too perfect maybe. So let's come in and start to add a little bit more variation, a little bit more irregularity to this. So let's go back to our gradient ramp. Let's come down toward some of these lower attributes here, and let's start to add a little bit more irregularity to this. So we can come in, we'll take the noise amount for this gradient ramp and start to dial this up. There we go, and that starts to add a little bit of irregularity to this. We can actually change the noise type from a regular noise to a fractal noise to a turbulence noise. In my case, I actually like the way that turbulence noise looks. So let's come in and we'll maybe leave that amount set to a value a little bit closer to 1 because that's giving us a pretty good result. So that will start to add a little bit of irregularity to this. And if we come back and render, we should be able to see that, although it's going to be some pretty small details that we're adding in here. So you can definitely start to see a little bit more of that irregularity. But like I said, it's really, really small noise. So let's come in and let's make this noise pattern a little bit larger. Let's take our size for this and maybe crank this up to value of 2. Yeah, we can probably go a little bit higher than that. Let's maybe try something closer to 5, maybe even closer to 7. There we go. So now we're getting some larger details in here. Let this render out. There we go. That's starting to look now much, much better and much more natural. Okay, so we're off to a pretty good start with the overall shading of these particles. Now there's probably still a little bit more work that we could stand to do on these. So what we'll do is take just a few minutes in our next lesson to finish out the shading of these particles, and then we'll be ready to move on to some of the lighting and rendering capabilities of 3ds Max.